Hi everyone. Today I am doing a tutorial on how to use gel base and top coat with dip powder as opposed to using the dip liquid 3-step system. I'm doing it on a swatch because, as you can see, I've recently done my manicure and I am not ready to redo it yet. The way I usually do my manicure is I build my apex up with clear powder before I start with the colored powders. But on a swatch, I'm not going to do that. But what you do is you start with the first coat, apply thin layer of the gel base. Cure it for just a few seconds. I use an LED light, so it takes about half the time that a UV light would take. So about 30 seconds is all it needs for the first cure. Okay. Then I apply another thin coat of the gel base. And I dip into the powder. Now you can also, of course, swatch by the pour over method, where you would pour from one device into another. But then you cure again. Now for my actual nails, I usually cure longer than 30 seconds, simply because I want to make sure that they're good and solidly cured. I'll usually cure for 90 seconds, especially with the darker colored powders. The darker the color, the longer time I give it. The color that I'm using is Perfectly Dip's Moonflower. It is a color changer, as you can see. It goes from purple at cold temperature to a medium blue, which I have on my nails, at a medium warm temperature, and then to an ice blue at hot. But after you've cured with the lamp, then you brush off any excess powder. You can use a brush like this, or you can use a brush like this even, a kind of medium stiff bristle brush. Medium bristled toothbrushes work well as well. And once you've brushed off the dust from your first layer, go back in, apply a second layer. Again, you want to use thin coats so that you don't end up with a thick nail bed on your fingers. A thin coat, then you dip. You can either dip into a jar at an angle. You can pour it into a little cup like I've got here, a little paper cupcake liner. Or you can do the pour over method. Because I'm doing swatches, I'm just laying it flat into the cupcake liner. Tap off any excess, cure it, brush off your excess dust and do a third, again, thin layer. I usually do on my nails 3 layers of the color. It will make my nails, you know, a little bit thicker than if I did 2, but I like the saturation of color that is achieved by 3 layers versus 2 layers. There's some colors, like the Moonflower, can be sort of translucent. It's kind of a jelly color. And I don't want it so translucent that the color is not really, I guess I could say, popping on my nails. I like it to really show off. After all, if I'm going to do my nails, I want to be able to show them off. And once you've done 3 layers, especially depending on what color I'm using, some colors I don't necessarily do a clear layer on top to encapsulate it. Others I do. If it has glitter in it, I definitely do a clear coat layer. If I have to buff it, because sometimes I don't even have to buff doing the gel method. And in fact, 9 times out of 10, I don't have to buff doing the gel method. But just in case I do need to, I always try to do very thin layers of powder. And then once I've gotten my 3 layers of color, I go in and I put a layer of clear over it. But the clear will help protect when you're buffing. It'll help keep the color from being buffed out, because that can happen. And if it has any glitter in it, it'll help keep the glitter color from being buffed out and ending up with silver specks within your nails. Because that will happen. A lot of glitters, when they're buffed, end up turning silver. But once I've got my clear layer on, I'll then take one of my files and buffers, and I'll just buff it smooth. And the clear, and so the only thing I'm basically buffing off possibly is a layer of clear. I'm not buffing down to the colors. I'm just barely trying to get the edge smooth, the surface and edges smooth. Now on my natural nails, I usually try to get the shape done in between doing my apex and clear layer underneath before I start doing my color layers. That way I'm not having to file and buff much afterwards, if at all. Okay, I'm going to give that another little bit of time in the light. Clean up my area here for a second. When I'm doing my actual nails, I'll use my little handy finger rest to rest my finger on, because it gives me a good sturdy base to rest and raise my nail up to a height to use. As you can see, I used to use a jar and it scuffed up the jar. So that's why I created these nice little finger rests. Although I don't sell any that look exactly like this. This was the prototype. I just had some extra glitter laying around that I played with. Okay, now that I've got it buffed and smooth with the I put another layer of the gel foundation base, and I cap the edges. I cap all 3 edges with the base at that time. Give that a cure. And at that point, I am done with the foundation base, with the gel foundation base. And I'm going to be moving on to the top coat. Now, I use a no wipe top coat. Currently, I'm using Beetles. I've used other brands and probably will use even more brands at some point in the future. Beetles just happens to be what I have at the moment to use. When I'm doing my nails also, the gel base gives you a lot of time to work with it. So that if you have any need to clean up your cuticle area, a lot of people will use orange sticks or toothpicks. I personally like to use my dotting pen, my dotting tool. It came in a set of 4 or 5, each with a different color swirl in the handle for the different sizes. And I used the blue one with the kind of the long pointy ball tip on it, as opposed to the rounded ball. It's the skinny, smallest one, and what it allows me to do is I can go around my cuticle and clean up in between the layers before I cure. And it being the gel, it gives me lots of time to do that because it doesn't dry by air. It has to cure in the light. Now, once I've cured the top layer of foundation, I then go back in with the top coat. Again, I put a thin layer, but I make sure it's thoroughly covered so that I don't end up with any gaps in the shine. A solid coverage, but thin layer. And then I go and I cap my edges. Capping the edges is important so that you don't end up with lifting at your edges. And then I cure that. Now, a lot of the times I will give that cure, being my final cure, I'll give it 2 or 3 times to make sure that it is absolutely thoroughly cured. I can usually do one whole hand at a time for each cure. So I do all 5 fingers on one hand, cure, clean them off, do another layer, make sure I've got, I do my cuticles in between before I cure. And then once I've got the final cure in, it's nice and smooth and just as hard as if I were to use, or almost as hard as if I had used the dip liquids. The only difference is I'm allergic to the dip liquids, so I don't end up with dip flu when I use the gel base. But if I were to use the dip liquids, I would. But as you can see, it's nice and smooth I had to do very little buffing, if any at all. I didn't really actually have to buff it. It was nice and smooth. I didn't, as you can see, my current manicure is nice and smooth as well, and I didn't do any buffing on my nails. This is strictly no buffing at all. And the thin layers you want so that you don't end up with chiclets on your nails. But that is how we do the gel base and gel top coat with the dip powder liquids. Hope you enjoyed the tutorial.